Steve, I was talking to someone recently who works at a major tech company. And one of the things that I found really interesting was that a big focus with tech right now is AI. And you would look at them, you would think everything is going right. But to them, no. They are more in fear of their job than they've ever been in fear before. Why is it, do you think?
Well, and so a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I've been working with IT professionals, software engineers, that sort of thing for many years. And that's been a common theme because they're like, hey, our company is cutting edge and I've got a great job and our future looks bright. But somebody could come in tomorrow or next month or in 6 months with something more revolutionary that could replace us. And so they've always, kind of told me that we always know that there's that risk that, I could lose my job in 6 months because something better comes along. And so I've heard that for years as to why people want to establish financial independence. They want to have the side income just in case something like that happened. But that has accelerated in the last year because of AI, because there's more types of jobs that AI can replace in software, in some of those middle management type roles, even with accounting and some legal roles where AI can do it faster than any human can. And so, yeah, there is more and more of that fear of, hey, what happens if AI takes my job in the future? You're right.
Yeah, well, it's funny, right? Because it's almost like, instead of there being this focal point on, them worrying about money, they're not really worried about money today. They're worried about money tomorrow, to the point that, it's that big question of what happens if I lose my job? How am I going to pay my bills? And it almost feels backwards in a way, because on paper, they're doing everything right, but they feel in some ways even less secure by someone making the minimum wage. I mean, if you think about it from that perspective, like you said, you've seen that for years. Do you feel like this is something that is AI is the problem today, but 10 years ago, it was some other sort of problem, and that's always going to be an issue?
Well, I think there's a few things there. I mean, AI is an issue today for that particular market. Again, AI is not going to replace plumbers and electricians and HVAC workers and roofers and, some of those things like that. But yes, it can replace some software engineers, middle management, different things like that. But the issue, in my opinion, isn't that so much as it is how the traditional investing model has worked for 100 years. I mean, you think about that, back in the 1920s and early 30s, that's when they started Social Security, because people were 65 years old, which was the life expectancy, and they would just work until they die. Or, some were in the 30s, they said, hey, let's have Social Security because people are starting to live until 70, but they're retiring around 65, and we just want to make sure they survive that last 4 or 5 years with a little bit of money in their pocket. That's kind of where Social Security came from. But up until 100 years ago, people worked till they died. Well, then when people said, well, they're going to work, they're going to retire and live off of income for a while, it kind of changed how investing was. And so people said, well, gosh, we're going to prepare for 40 years to prepare for that retirement at age 65. And that was the prevailing thought for, 75 to 100 years. All right, we're going to set money aside for 40 years, let it grow, and then eventually we'll live off that after retirement. And that's where some of the things, mutual funds, and if you look in the 70s, that's where 401ks and IRAs became available. And so people started setting money aside with this long-term plan. But what has changed is just the way that we use money. And right now, and most people are on that 40, 45-year plan because that's what it's been for 100 years. The thing is, there's things you can do now that create cash flow that can accelerate when you achieve financial independence. And when you look at people that may lose their job from AI or software or whatever that might be, what they need is not just a pile of money to pay bills for a little bit. It's some income to cover their expenses until they find that next job. And so having that cash flow helps them bridge that gap until they get their next job. And if they've built enough cash flow, maybe they don't need that next job. And so that's kind of the difference. If you look at it from that standpoint, is, these people are trying to build something that's going to be an emergency for them. If something happens, if there is an emergency financially, they've got that cash flow coming in, but with the long-term goal of getting to the point where they don't need a job at all.
Yeah, it's funny, as you're talking here, I had that eureka type moment where I realized what we're talking about is, on the one hand, you have some people who are literally making $500,000 a year in tech. They're making more money than they ever have before. And what they don't have right? They feel like they have some degree of income security, but that's not the same thing as job security. And that's certainly not the same thing as financial security. And so really what we're talking about is trying to find the balance between all of those different things and that strategy to have that protection behind what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, right?
Yeah, and I'll share a couple things there. And this is something I learned early in my career because I remember having these two conversations not that far apart. I met with a doctor. At the time, he was making $400,000 a year. He was doing pretty darn good, but because of his house payment, his car payment, his second house, the cabin on the lake, the vacations, all these different things that he was kind of expected to have as a doctor, all those expenses ate almost every dime of his income. He was barely getting by. He wasn't even retired, wasn't saving anything. And he was trying to figure out, how on earth am I ever going to retire? I can't even set aside money. And so the income doesn't make him wealthy. Okay. At the same time, or about the same time, I met with a gentleman, and this guy was simple. He had never made more than $30,000 in his life, but he'd saved it. He'd budgeted well. He had paid off his house. He'd actually he was a mechanic. He had a garage right next to his house where he worked on cars that he enjoyed doing, and that was all paid for. And so he was cash flowing. He had a very disciplined budget, and he was in fantastic financial shape. So it's not so much how much you make, it's how you save it, how you spend it, how you budget it. So that's really one thing that kind of people have to look at differently is if you're struggling financially, it's not what you make, it's how you budget and what you're saving. Now, with that said, then you get into what is stable. That's kind of what you were asking is, okay, financial stability. And again, if those two examples, if the doctor has $20,000 set aside for an emergency, that's not going to last him very long, whereas this other guy, $20,000, that's a year's worth of expenses easily, and then some. He's got more stability. And so your stability is how stable is your job? What are the chances that you could lose it? And if you did, how much emergency funds do you have, or how much passive cash flow do you have to cover your expenses? And all those things combined are what make up your stability.
Yeah, it's funny. It comes to mind. I'm just thinking here that at the rate we're going with some of the prices for these video streaming, subscription services like Netflix, I mean, we all might need an emergency fund of $10,000, $20,000 a month just for that. But,
both my kids are in college, and we had the conversation a couple of days ago that, my goodness, we have Amazon Prime and Netflix and Disney and Paramount Plus and HBO Max. I'm like, do we really need 5 of those?
Right. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I was talking about that, with my own family and kids too, right? Where it's like, hey, we've used this service once over the last 5 months. We could just buy the movies outright. That's how to get you with that stickiness.
We have all those subscriptions, and most nights my wife and I sit down and buy a movie to watch. So
right. Or the alternative is, hey, we have all these and there's still nothing to watch. And by the way, for anyone listening, what we're talking about today, and this is kind of what we talk about in general, looking at wealth creation, looking at the ability to develop financial strategies to achieve financial freedom from these exact type of topics. That's what this podcast is about. It's how money actually works in the real world versus how people think it works. And the gap is where most people get stuck. In other words, if we think about it this way, if someone is making, say, 150 or 200,000 a year, or even, 50 to 100,000 a year, but it can disappear, what do you really have? You have something that is temporary and finite. And the trick is trying to find a way, and I'm sure you would have thoughts on this, Steve, is trying to find a way to make it so that you have a little bit more of a shield there than always be worrying if, your flexibility in your life is done for if you lose that primary source of income. Any thoughts there?
So, it sounds like you're talking about, if you lose your job, what is your backup? It really diversification of income. So yeah, you've got a job, maybe you have a side hustle or something else in addition. Okay, maybe that's 2 income sources. But, when you start getting things like passive cash flow from your investments, those create additional income sources. And so, personally, I have dozens where, okay, I've got a little side business here that I own that generates a little cash flow over here. And I have this passive investment that generates some returns here. And I've got this. And so I've got that diversification so that if I was to stop working and make nothing, that's okay. There's different sources of income. And that's where that diversification comes in handy.
Well, to put it another way, right? It goes back to the real issue isn't income, but there's a certain irony when you think about meeting a stranger at a party or an event, right? Oftentimes the first thing they ask is, what do you do? And then they start to imagine, well, how much does that type of role make? And ironically, again, being that sort of position is not forever, it's temporary. You're left with this sort of thing that the issue that we have to face here is, when we're looking at income, it's having that dependency on a single source. And that's kind of what you talk about, having multiple sources of cash flow. Without that, we're effectively stuck very quickly if something goes haywire or AI replaces all of our jobs.
Right.
And so, if your entire financial life depends on one source, that's not diversified at all, right? I mean, if you think about it from that perspective, like, where does someone even go to get started to get away from that?
I mean, it starts with a mindset shift. And so if you think about that, most people, again, I go back to the traditional investing approach. You set money aside for 40 years, you build a big pile, and you hope that pile lasts long enough. So if you think about that, people talk about, what's your magic number? I've heard 2 million, 3 million. I heard just the other day, $5 million is how much you need to have financial independence. And I disagree with that. But imagine you had a pile of money. Let's say it was all gold coins. Well, when you go to retire someday, every time you go to pay an expense, you have to take a coin off of that pile. Whether that's your house payment and whether you mortgage or rent, doesn't matter, car payment, Netflix subscriptions, insurance, utilities, all those things are monthly expenses, and you got to keep pulling coins off of that pile, and you hope the pile lasts long enough. That's the traditional approach. Whereas if you think of it from having a goose that lays a golden egg, and every day you spend just whatever the golden egg is worth, then you will never run out of money. And that's the difference, is understanding that cash flow importance and starting to build cash flow to cover your expenses, because that's how you create financial freedom. So that first mindset shift would be thinking of cash flow first. When I made that shift, that's what had the biggest impact on me turning around my finances, was I've got to find passive cash flow, not just cash flow from work, but cash flow from other sources. And that's how I ended up creating financial independence so quickly. So that mentality from thinking cash flow first, that's huge. The second one, you already touched on it, Dave, diversification. And so a lot of people think, I'm going to invest in the stock market. I've got money there. I'm in good shape. And I'm diversified because I've got tech stocks and healthcare stocks and finance stocks. And guess what? They're all stocks. When the stock market goes down, they all go down together. Now, usually when it goes up, they all go up together, but that's not diversification. And so, like within my portfolio, I have, different things from real estate to a stock market, sure, but crypto, private lending, agriculture. I mean, think about 2022, when inflation went up really high, the stock market crashed as a result. It went down 20 to 30%. But what happened to the price of groceries? It went up a lot. And so the assets that I had in agriculture went up with the price of produce instead of going down with the stock market. That's diversification. So that if one thing goes down, it's not dragging everything else down. Your other things can still go up. So that true diversification, that's the second mindset shift. And then the third one, to create financial independence, it's understanding the difference between growing what you have and creating new wealth. Most people only think about, hey, I'm going to invest this and I'm either going to earn a fixed rate of return, such as a CD or a bond or private lending, or they're going to put it in something that they hope goes up, the stock market, gold, crypto, something like that. And that's what most people think of as investing, and that's all they think of. But there's a couple of other investment opportunities that create new wealth. And one of them is real estate, and the other is businesses. And if you look at the 1,000 wealthiest people in America, every one of them made their money by owning a business or by owning real estate. Now, doesn't mean you need to try and become a billionaire, but the fact that the billionaires all got there the same way, if you did that on a very small scale, had a small little side business that's generating an extra $3,000, $5,000, $8,000 a month, that can be life-changing. And so understanding how to create wealth with real estate or a business, as well as to invest wisely to grow what you have, that combination, that's how you create financial independence faster.
Well, I guess, just to stop for a second there, some of those shifts that you're discussing, it kind of leads me to a few more questions. The first question, would you say between all of that, is one of them a larger blind spot that most people don't see? Or is there something else beyond that? Or are they equally weighted between the three?
I'd say the biggest one is again, people realize they want diversification. They realize that, sooner or later that they're going to need that passive cash flow. But I think the biggest blind spot would be the wealth creation. People don't think that way. They think, investing is just you put money in and you let it grow because that's what they've heard for 50 years or however many years. That's been the prevailing, you put money in a stock market, in a fund, in an ETF, and a whatever, and hopefully it goes up. Or you put it over here and it earns a fixed rate. And that's all most people think. They don't think wealth creation. And so, I think that would be the blind spot. They're not looking at real estate or business ownership. And the reason for those are two things. One is sometimes they just don't understand how incredibly powerful those are. And so, as a matter of fact, I just made a presentation the other day to a group explaining how the BRRRR strategy with real estate really works and how a very small investment over time when I say over time, over the next 10 years, can create massive tax-free income within 10 years, enough to retire on. Even if you started today with not that much, with just one property, I can show you how to use that because there is basically the BRRRR strategy, where you buy a house, rehab it, refinance it. Buy it, rehab it, rent it out, refinance it. And when you refinance it, you get your money back and you repeat the process. Buy a second house, do the whole thing again, get the money back, buy a third house. And it's not the income you get every month from those houses. It's the tax-free money you can get when you refinance them down the road. And so if you're acquiring 2 houses a year, starting in year 10 or 11, maybe you start refinancing a couple houses a year and pulling out huge chunks of tax-free cash flow. And that's what most people don't get. They're just thinking of, well, gosh, that house is making $200 a month or $400 a month, and that's nice. They're not seeing the big picture of the incredible wealth creation and tax-free income they get down the road. So I think that's one reason people are missing it. And again, the same type of thing with real estate, with owning a business, is they're not seeing the big picture of how much wealth it really creates. And both of them have huge tax benefits at the same time. So not understanding how much wealth gets created by those two, that's the biggest issue. And then the second one is not understanding the time commitment. A lot of people know if you're a business owner, that takes tons of time. Yeah, it does. If that is the main thing you do and you're running that business and managing that business all the time, yeah, it takes a lot of time. And so would real estate if you're doing all the work. The thing is, you can hire a property manager to manage that property for you. I don't touch my properties. I haven't been to most of them in years, and I don't want to go. So I have a property manager, and they do a much better job than I could ever do. And I make more money after paying them than I would have if I was managing it myself and trying to save that management fee. Okay. And so that same approach works on a business. You can actually hire people to start and run a business for you. So it's not taking your time. You're spending an hour a week and you're getting passive cash flow from it. And so a lot of people don't realize that you can do things like that. And that's how you build a little extra passive cash flow from a business, from real estate. And that's how you create wealth instead of just growing what you have.
Right. And I guess it's worth stopping for a moment too. Sometimes when people talk about financial freedom, they assume we're talking about debt consolidation or something to that effect. But really what we're talking about is you only work if you want to, not because you have to, right? I mean, is there anything else you would say about how you would define financial freedom here?
That's a great question. Because again, that's really the goal of what we try and teach in the Unbroken Investing community is how do you achieve financial freedom? And some of the people ask, well, what is that? It really is different for everybody. So for some people, financial freedom is, yep, I'll never have to work another day in my life. And that's great. I have all the money I'll ever need, all the cash flow, and that's great. For others, financial freedom may just be the ability to do what you want, when you want, where you want. So, hey, I'm going to keep working, but I'm going to be a digital nomad. I love to travel and I can do my job from anywhere. Cool. For some people, that's financial freedom. Honestly, I'm closer to that one. I've got, cash flow coming in to cover a variety of different things, but I've got a job that I can do from anywhere. Take my laptop and my camera and I'll talk to Dave from time to time and do a few other things in the investing community. And I can do that from anywhere. And that was by design. I wanted a business that I could run from anywhere. And that gives me that freedom to do what I want, when I want, and where I want. And so understanding what you want financial freedom to be is part of the challenge. Once you understand where you are and where you want to be, what your financial freedom, your financial independence looks like, then you create that plan to get there. And so, yeah, the definition, there is no consistent definition from one person to another. And maybe Merriam-Webster dictionary has a definition. I don't know. I've never looked it up, but probably not.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, especially in this era of AI. I was thinking about this just the other day. How often do people buy encyclopedias or dictionaries at this point? Or, do they just visit their favorite AI model or, the Googles of the world?
I still use dictionaries and encyclopedias. That's how I reach the top shelf up there. I got to stack them up and step up onto them.
I totally understand. They make an impressive paperweight, and certainly they can be great for the background of, say, a podcast, I suppose. But, when you kind of talk about, so really that blind spot that most people miss, it goes back to the idea of wealth creation. And one of the other ways that I would think about it is that concept of, deploying your money more intelligently. And what I mean there is that it's really easy to run in that situation where we're not letting our money work for ourselves when we're not working. That's the only time that our money is working, is when we're generating ourselves. But if you talk about trying to multiply the effects of that money and get a snowball effect, you have to have some sort of way to have that money cascade into something larger. So when you approach it that way, and someone realizes that concept that we're talking about, what changes when someone thinks that way? And how do they even begin to do something with that knowledge?
So a couple of things. I forget which investing book I'd read this in, but he referred to all of his dollars as soldiers, his investment dollars. And so, hey, when I invest money, I'm going to send my dollar soldiers out there to go work for me. Okay, I like that analogy. That way you talk about money working for you when you're sleeping, but then you take that next level is, okay, do you want your soldiers making a minimum wage, or do you want them making making a lot more money? So you talk about using money intelligently. The better, the more strategic you are with that money, the higher it's going to earn every hour, so to speak. So instead of making minimum wage, now it's making a bunch of money. And so it's the same dollars and going to work for you. They're just working smarter. And so that's part of that. Trying to think what else was the second part.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting the way that you described that, right? Because I'm just thinking, you have your troops on the ground, as you just described it there, which is a fascinating analogy. And it really goes back to being able to visualize your money working for you. But it's really connecting how much it reduces stress and uncertainty if you're not worried about AI replacing your job, because you know that you're getting income from multiple sources.
Right.
And then it's a matter of trying to identify how you can even leverage AI to, help you deploy or build passive income in other ways too, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on that?
So part of the key is everyone's going to be different. Something that works for me may not work for you, may not work for the next person. A lot of that is what you know and what you're comfortable with, what your experiences are. But with most people, there's something that they're going to feel comfortable with that, yeah, I can put my money to work over there, generating income for me. And maybe they're using AI, maybe they're not. For some people, again, I'm doing a podcast here. There's some people that are really good at podcasts and everyone wants to watch them, and, they get bunches of followers and, they're making money from YouTube. There's other people that are influencers and they're, driving traffic to certain websites. It's called being an affiliate. There's people who do that to make a living. Different people have different side hustles, different preferences. And so there is no one answer for everybody. And that's the key. That's why you figure out where you want to go, where you are, and you look at all the different ways to get there. And there's a lot of them these days. There are so many more opportunities to make money, both passive, or just, what I call semi-active, little side hustle, takes an hour or two a week, that sort of thing. There's so many more of those available now than that was even fathomable 20 years ago. And so it's just finding what works for you.
Well, I hear you there. And we all have different talents. There's no question. But there has to be, some amount of tried and true methodologies. And so, if you look at Steve today versus, Steve when he started out on his career, if you were starting over tomorrow, there has to be certain things in terms of the way that you would approach building out diversified sources of income. What would that look like to you?
Well, and again, I've been doing this for 30 years and I've learned a lot over the years. And so, yeah, knowing what I know now, what would I have done 20 or 30 years ago? Huge difference. I would have started investing in real estate sooner. That's certainly one thing I would have done. But the other thing is I spent the first 10 years of my career, I was a financial advisor. I did what you're supposed to do with investing in stocks and funds and diversifying and all that sort of stuff. And after 10 years, I realized I wasn't making much progress. It was a long, slow road, and I figured there has to be a better way. So that was one of the things that I learned is there's got to be something better than the traditional way. So that was kind of one of the revelations I had. And then another one I'd mentioned was cash flow. Once I started putting a focus on cash flow, it changed everything. Because what happened was this. Before that, if you'd said, hey, what's your strategy with investing? Yeah, I want to make a lot of return. I want to make a good return. I want to make a lot of money in investing. Awesome. How do you find that? It's like, saying, hey, Dave, could you introduce me to somebody? Well, that's too vague. But if I say, hey, introduce me to your next door neighbor? Well, yeah, Bill or Joe. All of a sudden, exactly, it's going to be an easy thing to do. When you tell people, hey, I just want to make a bunch of money investing, I want a great return, that's too vague. But when I started saying, I'm looking for specific cash flow generating assets that are not tied to the stock market and not tied to real estate, what can I find? And when I started asking that very specific question, when I was very focused on what I wanted, I started finding them. I'd never found those before. I didn't even know they existed. They did exist. I just wasn't finding them because I wasn't looking for them. And so when you get clear about what it is you want, they become easier to find.
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful thing there. And ironically, it leads to a larger problem potentially for people too. But on the one hand, having specificity with your goal makes it that much easier to obtain it, right? It needs to be measurable. That's a common concept. But then the other side, right, is what do you do when you don't know what goal to make? Because you don't necessarily, you may be great in tech, you may be a doctor, but this is a field that is completely different to you. Where do you go?
Well, and I guess that's why you consult experts. I mean, we have a community. That's one of the things we do is we help educate. There's a lot to learn about investing, and you could spend a little bit of time or tons of time. I spend hours and hours a day, and I've done it for 30 years. There's a lot you could learn. Or there's people who, a few minutes here and there, and that's, as long as they got the basics, that's fine. But, knowing where to go to find those resources to gain that education, to gain access to investments you wouldn't find elsewhere, and to find mentors who have been there and maybe they're a couple years ahead of you and they're there to help you, that sort of stuff. And so that's what Unbroken Investing does. And so that's a starting point for a lot of people because a lot of people, again, they don't know. And one of the things about that is they don't know what's possible. What they do know is just what they see. And if you think about this, the investing companies, Fidelity, Edward Jones, again, I love Fidelity. I've got a Fidelity account. I've had it for years. I like them, but all these different companies that have investments like stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, they are only allowed to show you registered securities. That's all they can talk about. And they spend billions and billions of dollars for investing so that when you go search investing online, what's going to come up? Stocks and bonds and that sort of stuff, because they spend so much money advertising to get you to use their services. But the problem is that kind of blinds some people to what is really out there. So to your point, some people don't know how to set a goal because they don't know what all the options are. Or they set a goal that's frankly way lower than it should be because they think, gosh, man, if I could only earn 10% a year, I'd be doing fantastic. No, there's actually way more things out there that earn above that people just don't know of because they're not securities, because your financial advisor can't talk about them. And so that's one of the challenges you mentioned about setting a goal. It can be hard if you don't know what the options are.
Well, that reminds me of a concept I've heard you say before. And it's tough, right? We all potentially have a little of our own ego. Some of us have, bachelor's degrees or master's degrees or even more advanced education past that. So we want to say that we're done with education. But the reality is that many successful people never stop learning. And you talk about a three-legged stool approach to successful investing. Can you describe that to everyone here today?
Well, again, that's kind of what I was talking about just now with the education, the finding investments that you can't find anywhere else, and then having the community to guide you and help you along the way. So that's what Unbroken Investing provides are those three things.
Also, it's really just, to simplify that, right? We're talking about those three legs are education and opportunity and discipline. And part of what you get from a community is you get examples to follow. You get potentially being able to be pushed or to learn from peers. You get to combine resources, their training influences your training and vice versa. Or in this case, their due diligence might influence your due diligence. And then opportunities, it goes back to, okay, now I know rules that I want to follow. I have a game plan, but I don't know where to start. And, how can I shortcut this? How can I speed this up so that I'm not spending the next 2 years trying to actually implement a plan? And the education helps you do all of those different things. I think that's one thing that people are always wary about is, especially when you're in a high pressure job where you might actually be working closer to 60 or 70 hours versus 40 hours, you don't have that mental bandwidth to focus on all these things, and finding ways to shortcut by learning from those who have done it before is potentially very valuable. Isn't there a quote that you've kind of said about that before?
Yeah, there's two things there. One is a quote that I've mentioned before. A smart man learns from his mistakes. A brilliant man learns from other people's mistakes. And that has never been more relevant than today. I had a conversation today with a brand new member of the community, and he's coming to me asking for advice on, hey, how can I get back on track? I had, don't want to give in too many details, but several $100,000 that he found out this week is completely gone. He invested it in a place that had done pretty good, or so he thought. Turns out that the person is now in FBI custody. It wasn't real, and his money is gone. How does he recover? So okay, what did he do wrong? What did he learn? And what's the name of it? So we can learn from his mistake and make sure that we're not putting money into that same thing. Well, that may sound like it's too late, but you know what? We have a list of over 80 opportunities like that in our community where we have identified, hey, this doesn't pass. Something's not right here, or that sort of thing. So learning from others' mistakes, that's huge, okay? But then the other thing you mentioned was interesting is time. It's like, yeah, people work 60 hours a week, 70 hours a week. They just don't have time for this. Time to learn much about investing or time for that. And the way I look at it, to survive today, you want to take care of if you need oxygen, food, and water. You want to try and stay healthy, and people spend time, learning a little bit about, healthcare and, all right, what do I need to eat? What's my diet? What's this? And the other thing you need, how do you buy food? How do you live indoors? How do you do all those things? You need money. But people don't study money. So many people, they don't look at it. They don't pay attention to maybe a little bit of budgeting if they have to, some of them not. But the more you understand money, the more money can take care of you. And so it's one of those where even if you're busy, you should find time. Again, I'm not saying study it, hours and hours every day. But if you don't understand how money works, how to create wealth and financial independence, then you're going to be stuck needing money for the rest of your life.
That's a really interesting thing to say about, studying money and the irony in terms of how many people don't do that. I mean, I think back to like what undergraduate programs or college degrees do you have where you take a finance class? A lot of times you don't. You're studying all the arts and so forth, but this is something that gets skipped over. I guess that's why we've been doing things the same way for the last 50 years.
Yeah. Well, that and the companies that make billions of dollars off us doing it that way, they want to keep it that way.
Right. We can get a little conspiratorial there, but I mean, there's no question that they do, right? That's what lobbying is ultimately, is trying to either consolidate power or keep power in terms of whatever your economic goal is. So, if we kind of summarize everything that we've talked about today, we kind of bring it together. I think we've really looked at, that person, that hypothetical person who's making, $100,000 or $200,000 a year. They have a 401k. It seems like they've done everything they're supposed to on paper, but they don't feel secure. And so I guess the way that I would describe that is they've taken a great first step. They put themselves into a solid position to now springboard and grow exponentially. And if you were to recap, what that next step is for them or what they're missing now, how would you describe that?
Well, it's map, creating a map. Where are you and where do you want to go? And then how do you get there? And most people can figure out where they are financially. It may take a little bit of, talking to other people or creativity to figure out, okay, where do I want to go? Where do I want to be in 5 years financially? Okay. But once you figure that out, you got to create a plan. And I tell people, imagine that you're going to go on vacation. Well, first of all, where are you? Hey, I'm in New York City. Okay, that's where you are. Great. Where do you want to go? I don't know. All right. Well, you can't go anywhere until you figure out where you want to go. All right, I'm going to go to Miami. Great. Now you know where you are and you know where you're going. You're not done. You've got to figure out how to get there. You can take a boat, a plane, a train, drive, ride your bike. There's a lot of different ways to get from New York to Miami. It depends on how much time you have, how much money you have, and that sort of thing. With financial, it's the same type of thing. Where are you? Where do you want to go? And how do you want to get there? And that's going to determine there's things like risk tolerance, cash flow, diversification. All those are different pieces of that plan to get there. And that's where the community comes in handy, where we do planning to help figure out, what makes the most sense for you. What sort of what is your risk tolerance? That sort of thing. And so that'd really be the starting point for most people is where are you? Where do you want to go? And then starting to put together a plan for how to get there. And that's where a little bit of education comes in handy, because a lot of people don't know where they could go if they haven't done any studying, or at least looking at money. It's like, man, I didn't even know I could go to Miami. Hey, you could go to Europe. Did you know that? Yeah, I didn't even know that. And so with financial planning, hey, you could be financially free in 5 years. Yeah, I could. I didn't know that was an option. Yeah. All right. How do I put a plan together to do that? And that's the type of thing we do in our community. Once you figure out where you want to go, then you start putting those pieces together.
Well, I think you hit something there that probably resonates with a lot of people, especially if you're jumping into the comments anywhere on social media. So many people don't know where they're going, and they don't even know how to begin to comprehend the question. They're just trying to get a day.
They don't, but they cannot. That's the key.
Well, and that's the other part. And I think you hit that really well too, because I think if you go the mindset concept, just because you're in one place today doesn't mean that you can't be in an entirely different place in the future. And you also don't have to solve every possible thing that can happen over the next decade. It's one step in front of the other and following that plan and then adjusting that plan as you keep moving forward.
That's right.
So, if we kind of look at all this in totality, right, the takeaway it's not just about how much you make, it's about how your income is structured and what it's building. It's about the plan that you're putting together to have that money work for you. And ultimately, if everything depends on one source, that's where a lot of the stress can come from. It's AI today. 20 years ago, maybe it was the internet people were worried about. Is there anything else you'd say on that, Steve?
No, I think you nailed it.
And so, if we kind of look at, everything that we've talked about today, if you're listening to this and thinking that's exactly how you feel, that's what we're going to keep unpacking here on this podcast, not just ideas, but how this actually works in real life. And if you want to go deeper into anything that we've talked about, Steve has talked about our community a few different times. Steve, do you want to say anything else about the community within and inside Unbroken Investing?
Again, the community is there to provide education so you can help create a strategy that's going to be a fit for you, to provide access to investment opportunities and other opportunities that you don't have access to elsewhere. Again, that's what I was talking about earlier. Financial advisors can only give advice on securities. They can't give you advice on gold, on owning real estate, on crypto, on being a private lender. Those aren't securities. They're not allowed to talk about them. We can. We're just the opposite. We don't give advice on securities, but we can share some other things that might work for you and share some private investment opportunities you could not get elsewhere. And then it all comes together in a community. We have live weekly meetings. We have calls. We have different things you can do, 24/7 community. We can ask questions and help further your financial plan, either again online or with calls or something like that from other members of the community or from some of the mentors like Dave and I.
Thanks for sharing that, Steve. I think that's all for today. We'll be back again next week. And other than that, is there anything else you want to add?
No, that's pretty much it. All right. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, great. Yep. Thanks, Steve. Catch you later.
All right.